Hello, I'm Emma-Louise Coffey and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. Ahead of the open day at Teagasc Ballyhaise on Wednesday the 13th of July, Donal, Patton and Reilly join us to give insight into the performance being achieved at the dairy herd and how the research is addressing the key challenges affecting farmers in the region. And Barry started by giving an overview of the farm.
Yeah, so we have a 56 hectare milking block with 12 hectares just after coming in this year. It was previously in heifer ground, and we're also in the process of draining and reseeding another 5.6 hectares of an outblock. We're currently milking 120 cows with the plan to go to 140. We're a spring calving system and have been for the last number of years, with a mixture of high EBI, Friesian and Jersey crossbred cows.
And looking at the, I suppose, rolling average in terms of performance there, Barry, what sort of production and fertility performance do ye see and are ye achieving with the Ballyhaise herd?
Prior to 2015, we would have been sitting at sort of 420, 430 kilos of solids. I suppose we've risen that up to about 470 or 475. Over the last number of years on about 800 kilos of concentrate. It'll be slightly above the co-op average. However, our feed inputs will probably be south of the co-op average. It's probably up over north of the ton. We're sitting on an annual basis of about 460 fat, 365 protein. Again, co-op average sitting slightly less at maybe 410 and 340 protein. But there is numerous guys in the region who would be beating us on protein at the minute. 6 week calving rate, we're sort of sitting between that 80 and 85% over the last number of years. Again, well ahead of the co-op average of about 60%. And we have a calving interval of about 360 or 361 days, I think it was there last year.
And I guess if we consider the Ballyhaise farm, you know, there's a research function and also an education function to the farm. So, you know, while it's not totally comparable with a commercial farm, there is elements of co-op performance difference that you have compared, Barry. If we look at the research side of things, to you, Donal, what is the, I suppose, current research experiments that you're carrying out at Ballyhaise?
Yeah, so Emma-Louise, we're on year 2 now of a 5-year programme. So we started in 2021, and I suppose we're tackling a number of issues, but the main one being clover, really. But I suppose the import of nitrogen into the system through both concentrate feed and clover. So as it is at the minute, we're running sort of 4 treatments, and within that there's 2 different sward types. So we've got grass only swards and then grass clover swards, and then we've got 2 different levels of feed input. So 600 kilos, which would have been, I suppose, traditionally where we'd have been at for the last good number of years, versus 1.2 tons, which, as Barry has said, is probably where most guys in the region would be at in terms of feed input. So look at, I suppose, we're kind of looking at this over, as say, a 5-year program. The big question in this part of the world around clover is persistence. So we've tried to front load the establishment to the first 2 to 3 years, you know, to front load it and do as much as we can up front, to give us that option to, or the opportunity to look at the persistence of those swards over time and see if the clover stays in the swards. I suppose the soil type here, it is heavy clay drumlin type soil, so obviously that's not as suitable for clover as more free draining soil. So yeah, that's a big part of it, is just seeing the persistence of the clover over time and seeing if we can keep it in the sward.
And on that persistency, Donal, have you had clover in the swards previously? You know, and is persistency something that you would perceive as an issue?
Yeah, we've dabbled with it a little bit. We've been doing, previous to this, we've been doing trials on grazing season length and calving date and feed inputs and a whole different range of stuff. But we have dabbled with it over the years. Haven't really, you know, gone at it really hard. But the little bits we did, yes, persistency was definitely an issue. And anecdotally talking to farmers locally, some guys who've done more of it than what we would do. I think that's the big issue, is actually keeping it there. And look, maybe that's an issue nationwide, but definitely for the lads in this region, that's the big one. Like.
And to you, Barry, in terms of the establishment of that white clover on farm, Donal said, you're really pushing hard and trying to establish it as soon as possible. Like, what is your strategy to get clover into the swards?
Yeah, so we've, as Donal said, is kind of front-loaded as much reseeding as possible. So I suppose what we're at wouldn't be recommended to a commercial farmer. So last year we basically reseeded 25% of the farm, and the same again this year. Plus we've also oversown 15% of the farm, and again the same again this year. And I suppose from next year on going forward, hopefully them numbers will be smaller. That will be down to sort of a 10% reseed and a 10% oversow again for the remaining years in the trial. And our process of establishment is basically we try and front load the reseed, so it's magic day sort of spray, go in with your lime, FYM, if you have it, get it on it, and then we have a local contractor here who comes in with a one pass and stitches in the grass and grass clover mixes, and it's the same again on the oversown. It's grazed tight late April, early May when conditions is still slightly damp, and it's 6 kilos to the hectare is the rate we go at here. Last year, both of the systems we used worked, and we got good establishment. Now look, at last year was probably the perfect year for clover in that we had a very dry autumn then to push it forward again. Our average clover content for the swards that we oversowed last year in May of this year was 15%, but there was a massive range in that 15%. So you had paddocks that it didn't work on, and then you had paddocks with up to 40% clover in it there in May this year. And of the 85% of the area we oversowed in 21, it has clover in it this year. The average clover content of our reseeds from last year in May of this year was 16%, but the range was much smaller than the oversow. And so we had one paddock that it's a poor paddock of itself anyway. The range is sort of from 6% to 26%, but 90% of the paddocks that we reseeded would have good clover content in them, and we'd be quite happy with them.
And it's an interesting comment you make in terms of the level of reseeding that you've done is not recommended, and also probably not realistic for dairy farmers unless, inevitably they have, additional ground or additional feed in the yard to fill the hole during that reseeding process. I suppose the level that you will bottom out at in year 3 on with your 10% reseed and 10% oversow is I guess reflective of what a lot of people are doing on farms. For paddocks, Barry, where ye have seen a low level of clover content, so you talk at the lower end of the range at 0.6%. Is there any actions you're going to take with those paddocks immediately, or will you leave that until year 3, 4 or 5? Yeah,
so some of them lower level paddocks we've gone in and oversown them again this year with the intentions of trying to bump up the clover content in them again. Now whether it'll work or not, that answer remains to be seen, I suppose.
It'd be fair to say, Barry, that those paddocks where we've struggled with clover content, there's reason, whether it be drainage or heavier paddocks, the more heavy clay paddocks that are struggling. So I suppose that would make sense.
And on that, Donal, say for those paddocks where you have achieved a strong level of clover content, so 20% plus, are ye altering fertiliser strategy, or are there particular rules within the research trial around fertiliser strategy going forward?
Yeah, well, look at what we did last year, Emma-Louise, from the point of view of trying to give it its best chance, and I didn't really mention it there, Barry didn't mention it, in terms of our steering group would have pushed us fairly strongly in terms of doing a bigger percentage than what we initially intended to do of area. So from the outset, really the persistence of it is the key question, and we kind of wanted to give it the best chance we could. So both on our oversown swards and on our reseeds last year, we actually pulled nitrogen from the date of sowing, so we didn't put on any nitrogen from that point on. Now, there was no real negatives to that, we'll say, on the reseeded ones, but definitely on the oversown ones, it left them quite hard to manage. Grass quality deteriorated for a number of rotations after until the clover took over. So that's basically what we did last year. We got a good establishment, so we plan to do the same this year in terms of pulling nitrogen off. So the swards we would have reseeded and oversown last year got, I think, in the region of around about 65 kilos of N in spring. So basically the same as all the other paddocks got in spring. And from April on, they haven't received any nitrogen.
And on your other aspect of the experiment, Donal, you have mentioned feeding level. And I suppose if we reflect on Barry's figures, you're looking at milk solids production in the herd of 470 kilos, which is, very substantial performance, and well above the co-op average. Is there more potential within the herd in terms of production per cow, or are you at your limit at 470 kilos?
Sure, look, there's always potential for more, I suppose. The old target was to get to 150, and now the next target is to get to 500, I suppose. But it's a thing that we would have. We get a bit of criticism on it over the years in terms of our productions, on the production side, that our production was low. We have improved that over the last number of years, but we're still modest enough on the feed level side of things. Now, I suppose usually when we're quoting those figures, we use co-op performance data. Now, when we're looking at the difference between our treatments, we'll be looking at milk recorded data, and there could be a bit of a differential there. So the 471 kilos last year was milk sold. Now, if we look at the differential between the feed input systems just on 1 year, and it's only 1 year's data, so you have to be careful about it, but it's kind of what we would have expected. So our cows that were on the high feed inputs, now we didn't actually manage to get to the 1.2 ton. I think we averaged around, I think it was for the two groups was 1.1 ton we actually fed. We did 505 kilos of milk solids versus 475 kilos of milk solids on 600 kilos of meal. So about a half a ton differential in feed and around about 30 kilos milk solids of a differential, which is kind of what we would have expected.
And the economic implications for that, Donal, is it paying to feed that extra supplement?
Well, look, I suppose I just done a few quick sums on it. On last year's feed price and last year's milk price, it was kind of break even. And even if you do it on this year's milk price, which is a record milk price, but also the feed input costs have gone up, it's still around about break even. So there's nothing, there's no major benefit in it as we've seen it so far. So look, it'll be interesting to follow that through for the number of years and see, because the reality is that there's very few people in this part of the world that's below a ton concentrate feeding level.
And Donal, to you, in relation to when we think about the, I suppose, environmental sustainability of a farm, the research that you're carrying out is focusing on, say, clover and I suppose the interaction with the level of nitrogen that you're spreading, and also feed inputs from external sources. I guess, where do you see that addressing the sustainability challenge within the region?
Yeah, so I suppose, look at when we were putting together the plan for the trial in sort of 2020, fertilizer prices, feed prices were a different place where they are now. So we're actually looking at really predominantly from the environmental point of view and reducing the N surplus. So if you take one extreme, we've got a system doing sort of where you're spreading 250 kilos of nitrogen, feeding 1.2 ton of concentrate. That's around about 200 kilo nitrogen surplus within that system, which would be normal enough for the more intense grazing guys. And we're trying to push that down to, hopefully, if we can get the clover established, and we have enough clover in the swards, half the fertilizer, which is 125 kilos, and half the meal or concentrate, which is 600 kilos. So potentially that's a 70% reduction in N surplus. Now, that only holds true if we can feed the herd within the confines of that system. So what I'm saying, or what I mean about that, if by reducing nitrogen fertilizer, we're dropping tonnage or grass growing, and we're ending up having to import silage into the system. Well, that's going to erode that 70%. But potentially looking at it from the outset, that's sort of the aim, is to get sort of a 70% reduction in the nitrogen surplus within the systems.
And to you, Barry, another aspect and a driver of the system, as I see it from the figures you've talked about today, is the fertility. Huge difference between the Ballyhaise herd and, the co-op average in terms of 6-week calving rate and calving interval. And, that will inevitably drive milk production performance and reduce the reliance on, I guess, milking over winter. What are the key drivers that I suppose help you achieve that high fertility performance relative to the average?
Look, we would have previously had a very high fertility herd. Last year we had a bit of a blip. We were involved in a couple of different things that has reduced that. However, hopefully we get the wheels back in the wagon now this year. But look at it, goes back to your basics in, having a high submission rate, cows in good body condition score, not running tight on grass in the springtime and keeping them in a high plane of nutrition going into the breeding season. We would be using a good chunk of sex semen here and then switching to beef fairly early. But so far, this year has been running fairly smoothly so far, and that, we've a 90+% submission rate, and we seem to be, running at a sort of a 50% non-return rate at the minute. But we had a good chunk of late calving cows last year, so that'll be dragging that down slightly. But yeah, we would be slightly ahead of the co-op average, and as you say, it would be helping our kilos of solids delivered to the co-op.
And finally, to you, Donal, there's an open day at the Ballyhaise farm on July 13th. What can farmers expect on the day?
Yeah, so look, I suppose, Emma-Louise, we'll be going through obviously more detail in terms of the current trial. Also looking back at some of the lessons we've learned over the last good number of years, been involved here in Ballyhaise with research. Then I suppose we'll break it down into the different components of successful systems. So the breeding being a big one for the region. So you've mentioned that there, the fertility, the average calving interval in the co-op here is over 400 days. So it's obviously a big issue. So breeding and fertility, sex semen usage, all that sort of stuff. We're going to have a bit of demonstration then on different methods of clover establishment. And then, there'll be lots of other little bits and pieces. We'll have a farmer forum as well at the end, where we've got 3 farmers from our catchment area that are, taking some of the research into practice. So we have Ger Pardy, who's going to chat a little bit on the clover establishment on his farm and how he's gone about it. We've got Killian Brennan, who's looking at the breeding side of things and improving the herd. So he's local here, County Cavan. We have David and Laura Hannon then looking at the whole thing around succession. So that'll be just towards the end of it. So it should be a good day.
Yeah, really looking forward to it. And any follow-up questions any of our listeners have on the day, Barry and Donal, you will be available to take them from us. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast. And my thanks to Barry Reilly and Donal Patton for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.